we're looking at Act 3, Scene 3, and you will probably be delighted to know that we are at the very centre of the play, so we've reached the peak of the mountain. Everything after this week is the downhill run to the end, and so it's a really momentous week. Okay, so it's a short scene, some really interesting little things to pick out, particularly about the presentation of the play, the way that the play works on the stage. So let's just get straight into it. So as usual, if you haven't already done so, you need to pause and read through. It won't take you long. It's less than 100 lines. I think it's even less than 50 lines. So yeah, make sure you've done that so that everything I say from here on in makes sense. Let's get into our analysis. So first of all, what happens in the scene? Well, the scene begins with the murderers waiting for Banquo. So they're outside of the castle and they're lying in wait for Banquo to come back with Fleance from his ride. And it's just before nightfall, so this is quite late in the day. And a third murderer has joined the group, which is significant. We're going to talk about that more in a moment. Now, Banquo and Fleance, as we know, have been riding. They appear, and the murderers talk about them approaching on horseback, but they actually walk onto the stage. And the murderers stop them and attack. Now, as Banquo is murdered, he calls out to Fleance, telling him to run and get away. And Banquo is killed and Fleance escapes. And the murderers know that they haven't completed the task as Macbeth wanted it done. And quite bravely, I think, bearing in mind Macbeth's state of mind and his behaviour, they decide that they're going to go and tell Macbeth what's happened. And actually that conversation we see in the next scene, and it completely transforms everything that happens for the rest of the play. Okay, so let's analyse. The first thing we need to notice is that the scene takes place in a park near the palace. Now, when you read the word park, you can't think about it as like a play park or a skate park. This is not something constructed for people to go and play in. You need to think more in terms of places like Snowdonia National Park or the Peak District or the Wolds. We need to think of just quite a broad open space, perhaps some woodland, probably woodland at this point in history. And so this is fairly remote, not a populated area. And so a place that's good for horse riding, which is what Banquo's gone out to do. So that's what we're talking about when we read the word park. Now, we notice that only 2 murderers were at the meeting with Macbeth in the previous scene, but now we've got a third murderer. And so one question you should be asking immediately is, where has this third man come from? What's he doing there? Now, the first murderer asks that question on behalf of the audience. He says to the third murderer, "Who told you to join us?" And the third murderer responds fairly simply, single word answer, Macbeth. He's a man of few words. And so we know that he's there on Macbeth's instruction. Now, the question we're asking is why? Now, the second murderer seems to be a little bit offended that there's a third murderer there, and what he says is quite telling. He says he needs not our mistrust. What he means is that Macbeth doesn't need to doubt their loyalty, doubt their ability to do the task. And he says that Macbeth told them very clearly what they had to do, and so there's no reason for him to doubt them. But actually, what we're discovering, that word mistrust is really important, because what we're discovering is that Macbeth is becoming paranoid. He sent a third man, firstly, because he doesn't trust the other 2. And so while he's paid those first 2 to murder Banquo and Fleance, the theory is that the third man is being paid to spy on the first 2 murderers and make sure that they behave in the way that they've been instructed to. We hear a lot of Macbeth talking about spies that he's placed around Scotland, and this is a really good example very early on. So maybe that third murderer is there because Macbeth doesn't trust the first two. But we also need to bear in mind that Macbeth is a trained soldier and he understands the way that battle works and the fact that armies have to be well balanced, or the attacking army needs to outnumber the army being attacked. And so this is also Macbeth being quite shrewd, because now the victims are outnumbered. Now, I know we could say, well, Fleance is just a little boy, and so 2 murderers should be enough. But we've got to remember that Macbeth is trying to offset the fact that Banquo is a trained soldier, a very skilled one. And so the third murderer means that they are really going to be overwhelmed. Banquo and Fleance are going to be overwhelmed. They're outnumbered. And so actually it's quite shrewd of Macbeth to send a third man. The suggestion here is that Macbeth's had a think about it, and on reflection has decided that if he wants to guarantee the job gets done, 2 murderers isn't going to be enough. Okay, so the first murderer sets the scene for us in the next little section. He says, the west yet glimmers with some streaks of day. It's quite a poetic way to say it. And there's some context here that's relevant. We've got to remember that in Shakespeare's theatre, there was no roof and plays were performed in the middle of the day because there was no lighting, and there was very little scenery. Now, if you're in school and you're allowed to, please don't just wander in, because we've got to keep you all safe. You can pop into my room and there's a display there about the Globe Theatre. If you aren't in school, or if you aren't allowed in, then in your own time, just Google the Globe. If you search for Shakespeare's Globe, you'll get some images of the Globe Theatre in London. Now, that was built as a replica of the original Globe Theatre, and so you should see from the pictures that there's a hole in the roof. It's open air, and plays are performed during the day. They do nighttime plays, but most of them happen during the day. And so Shakespeare is very limited in what can be done. He can't have lots of fancy scenery or lighting effects. So in a modern theatre, we wouldn't need to be told it was nightfall. We'd know, because the lighting would change or the scenery would look different. But here, we don't have any of that. And so what Shakespeare does, and he does this in all his plays, is hide the scenery in the conversations of the characters. And so this is a lovely little presentational trick. I quite enjoy trying to spot the scenery in the lines. Maybe it's something you could look out for as we move through the rest of the play. All the detail that will be shown through staging and lighting effects are in the language, and this is a really good example of that. If the first murderer didn't say that, we'd have no idea what time of day it was. Okay, so it's nightfall, and what we need to remember is that Shakespeare is using pathetic fallacy here, and it runs all the way through the play. One of the themes of Macbeth is light and dark, and we know from the scenes we've already looked at that bad things happen at night in this play. Night is associated with death and murder, and so we know that the onset of night spells doom for somebody. Okay, so we've got a bit of pathetic fallacy happening here. We've also got the language building our anticipation of the event. We know that this is the murder of Banquo, and so the language helps us to build towards that, increase the tension, building towards Banquo's arrival in the scene. So the first murderer says that the lated traveller is spurring his way. It's getting late. He's got a banquet to get to. He's hurrying back. And so he says that he's near. he near approaches. And so we've got this growing anticipation of Banquo's arrival. And then the third murderer says, "Hark, I hear horses." Now, Shakespeare did make use of some sound effects. Sound effects could be done. And so that would have been probably done through a sound effect in the theatre. But what this does is raise a practical issue, because you can't have Banquo riding a horse onto a small stage. It just doesn't work. And so Shakespeare's got to have some way of getting Banquo onto stage on foot and having it make sense, because we know that he's out riding. Now, Banquo also speaks before he appears on stage, so this builds our anticipation a little bit more. He asks for a light from off stage, and so again we know he's near. And the second murderer reasons that it must be Banquo because all of the other people that would be riding horses, the important people that would be riding towards the palace, are already there, and it tells us that Banquo's quite late. Because everybody else has already arrived. He's the last nobleman to arrive for the coronation banquet. Now, there's a question that gets raised by this, because if all the other guests are already at court, why is Banquo not there? Why is he late? Could it be that he's weighing up whether or not he's going to attend? Remember that Macduff has boycotted. He's not attended the coronation, and he's not going to be at this feast. And so it's just a theory. There's nothing specifically in the text to tell you this, but I like to think that Banquo's wrestling. He knows that Macbeth is suspicious. He knows that Macbeth is the most likely murderer of Duncan. And so I wonder whether this is Banquo wrestling with the idea of going to the banquet, because going seems to endorse Macbeth as king, and I'm not sure that Banquo is convinced he wants to do that. So now the second murderer lets us know that Banquo and Fleance have left their horses behind. That's what this line means. And this is the way that Shakespeare gets around that tricky issue of the horse on stage. And so the second murderer tells us that they're not going to be bringing their horses on. This is Shakespeare's get out to avoid having to have a horse appear. Now, this is quite a clever presentational trick, because Banquo and Fleance can now walk on stage. Now, this doesn't really make any sense, though. Why would Banquo and Fleance get off their horses in a remote place if they're late? Why would they leave their horses behind? And so the next the third murderer, I find this quite amusing because it makes no sense at all. It's just there to get around this presentational problem of the horse. The third murderer tells us that everybody does this. This is normal. So when you're approaching the king's palace, apparently you leave your horse behind a mile away and walk the rest of the way. And although that makes no sense at all, it does get around the issue of the horse. And so I find that quite amusing. Maybe I've been in lockdown for too long, but I find that quite funny. Anyway. Right, so the second murderer calls for a light, and what happens here in this little section, Banquo and Fleance come into the scene with a torch, and that means like a flaming torch, not a electric one, battery operated one, because they didn't have them. So there's fire on stage. It's quite spectacular, and it helps build this sense of this being at night. But look at the language here. It's really chaotic. You've got all sorts of murderers all saying little bits and bobs. You've got exclamations going on. You've got shouting. You've got all sorts of things going on. And it adds to the confusion and chaos of the scene. Remember, the witches wanted to bring chaos. And so whenever evil is at work, we've got chaos. We saw it back in Act 2, Scene 2, just after the murder of Duncan. We're seeing it again here. Everyone speaks at once. Everyone's saying just very brief things, and it adds to the pace and the drama of this moment. Okay, so Banquo greets the murderers here by talking about the weather, and this shows that he isn't suspicious of the men. He's greeting them quite amiably, just as you would greet a stranger on the road. He says, "Oh, it looks like there's going to be rain tonight," and this is just quite a friendly greeting. So it shows us how much of a shock what follows is to him. The first murderer replies with "let it come down," and he uses the rain as a metaphor here, not for the physical rain, but for the rain of blows that they're going to use to attack Banquo and kill him. And they set upon Banquo. This would be probably quite an elaborate fight. So even though that's quite a short stage direction, what it tells us is that there's probably going to be a set piece. Remember, Banquo's a soldier, so he's not going to, with his son right there, he's not going to go down without a fight. And so this is quite a spectacular moment in the play. Lots of action on stage, lots of interest for the audience. As Banquo tries to defend himself and his son, but is gradually overwhelmed by the three murderers. And so that's over quite quickly. And as Banquo dies, look at what we hear. He says, "Oh, treachery, fly, good Fleance, fly, 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 thou mayest revenge, O slave." And his exclamations here, look at the exclamation marks, and the repetition here show us how shocked and how much despair Banquo feels. He knows he's been betrayed, and that word treachery tells us that it's totally clear to Banquo that this is a setup. He's been betrayed, perhaps by somebody who knew he was going riding with his son, perhaps by somebody who showed an unhealthy interest in his outing that afternoon. If we remember the previous scene, it's clear that he's thinking that he's been set up by Macbeth. Now, lots of commentators, when they read this "O slave" here, say that Banquo is addressing the murderers, but I would argue that the singular noun tells us that he's not addressing three murderers, but one betrayer, and that is Macbeth. And so I think my personal view is that Banquo dies knowing that Macbeth has betrayed him. It's Macbeth that has sent these murderers. And the stage directions just say he dies. And look at the simplicity of those stage directions in contrast to the significance of what we're discovering here. Banquo, the only witness to the witch's prophecies, is dead, but Fleance, the boy who was prophesied would be king, has survived. Banquo has still got an heir. Now, this is the first point in the play that Macbeth's plans haven't succeeded. All the other plans he's made have succeeded. He's managed to do them all, not with the same effect that he was expecting, but he has managed to achieve them all. But this time it hasn't worked. And so this marks the pivotal moment in the play where things turn against Macbeth, and actually very little of what he tries to do succeeds from this point on. So we've got a simple stage direction showing us a really significant thing has happened. Right, so we turn to the murderers, and they point out the fact that there should be two bodies and there's only one. They failed because one of them has gone. And the second murderer really sums up the significance of this. He says, "We've lost best half of our affair." He recognises that out of the two, it was most important that Fleance died. He's understood that from Macbeth's instructions, but Fleance has escaped. And so they've failed in the most important part of their job. And they decide that they're going to go and tell Macbeth how much he's done. Before we summarise, I just want to go back to Banquo dying on stage. We've talked in the past about how difficult it is when a character dies on stage. We talked about that in terms of Duncan's death, that one of the reasons why it wasn't shown was because of the problem then of having a body on stage. How do you get rid of the body without the actor getting up and walking, which sort of ruins the moment. But here, Banquo has died on stage. Now, this partly satisfies the sort of tension that the audience have felt, because there's lots of talk of violence, but we haven't really seen any. Here we do. But also, what comes in the next scene makes total sense of Banquo being dead on stage. And we'll come to that next week. So that's just a little teaser trailer for what's coming next week. Okay, right. So what's important in this scene? First of all, this is the turning point in the action. As we've said, from this point on, everything goes wrong for Macbeth. And so the death of Banquo marks the turning point of the action of the play. It's a pivotal moment, and Shakespeare parked it right in the middle of the play. It's the central scene. We've also learned that Macbeth doesn't trust anyone, not even people he's paying to do things on his behalf. So Macbeth has become paranoid. We also see that he's quite shrewd, because he sent this third murderer to outnumber the victims to guarantee the success of the job. Now, what's also important, possibly the most important thing, is that Banquo's heir is alive at the end of this scene. And so everything that Macbeth was hoping that he would secure his reign has not worked. And this tells us that fate in this play, fate can't be cheated and it can't be altered. So we haven't talked a lot about fate. We're getting there. This becomes a really important theme for the latter part of the play. But fate can't be cheated or altered. You remember Macbeth said right at the beginning, if chance will have me king, then chance may crown me without my stir. And so he initially was quite happy to leave it up to fate to decide whether the prophecies were going to be true. Here he's tried to alter fate, and it hasn't worked. Now, as we've said, this is the first time in the play that one of Macbeth's plans has failed. And that really is why this scene's important. So what do I want you to do with it this week? Really simple question. So here's your response task. Why did Shakespeare put Banquo's death at the centre of the play? Now, I'm not going to spell it out to you. Everything you need has been included in what I've said about this scene. So if you've listened carefully, you should have plenty of things to say in response to this question. But just to guide you a little bit, here's some bullet points. Think about the shape of the play. This is a 5-act play with a central act that where we see the tipping point. So think about the shape of the play, the shape of tension. And actually you can think about the rising and falling tension through this play. We have high points and low points, high points and low points. So think about what's come before this scene and what might be happening after it. You also need to think about the context of the play, the fact that this is before a live audience who want to be entertained, and the play's gone on for quite a while now, and it's been all about violence that we haven't seen. So think about context and think about the effect that it has on the audience to have this right in the middle of the play, the death of Banquo, the attack of the soldier and his son escaping. So that's what you need to think about. Hope that's been useful. I quite like this scene. It's very straightforward, and I hope that there's plenty there for you to work with. So I look forward to seeing your responses, and I'll see you in the next tutorial. Bye.